All right, our final speaker for this session is Shanti Nachtergaele. She is a PhD candidate in musicology at McGill University, writing her dissertation on the sociomaterial history of the professional double bassist from 1760 to 1890. As a double bassist specializing in historical performance practices, she performs with early music ensembles including Tafel Music and Rosa Barocca. And she also teaches at the Festival de Musica in Santa Catarina in Brazil. Shanti is the recipient of an AMIS small research grant for students and a Grimmon Travel Award, Vanier Canada Graduate Scholarship, and the International Society of Bassists Special Recognition Award for Scholarship. Please welcome Shanti Nachtergaele.
This project is part of my dissertation titled A Sociomaterial History of the Professional Double Bassist, 1760 to 1890, which explores interactions between performers and their instruments and the sociomaterial entanglements that shaped identities of the double bass and its players. In this paper, I address one of the challenges of focusing on material culture and human-thing relationships when studying the history of the double bass, which is that the double bass in the 18th and 19th centuries especially is a very difficult thing to define. It was historically and remains today one of the least standardized instruments of the Western art music tradition. As one indication of the instrument's heterogeneity, sources dating from circa 1530 to 1865 provide almost 30 different tunings for what Peter McCarthy calls large bowed bass instruments, with 3 to 6 strings. Narrowing McCarthy's list down to true contrabass tunings still in use after 1750 leaves a group of 20, which can be categorized according to their number of strings and the intervals between open strings. Several tunings are closely related, with variants distinguished only by their lowest strings. Among the tunings listed here, sources identify 4 that became established as regional standards in the late 18th and 19th centuries. These are Viennese tuning, the chordal tuning F-A-D F-sharp-A, which was used by double bassists trained in Vienna and surrounding areas. It flourished between the 1760s and 1780s, but did not disappear until the 1840s. French tuning, the 3-string tuning in fifths, G-D-A, sounding an octave below the top 3 strings of the cello. This was the principal tuning used in France until the mid-1830s and was still used by some double bassists as late as the 1870s. Then we have Italian tuning, the 3-string double bass tuned in fourths, ADG, which was popular in Italy, England, and Spain. Italian tuning remained popular until the late 19th century, longer than both Viennese and French tunings. Viennese, French, and Italian tunings shared the common fate of eventually being superseded by German tuning, 4 strings tuned in fourths, E-A-D-G, which became the international standard by circa 1900 and is still the most common tuning used today. The transition was never instantaneous, and a combination of instruments could be found sometimes even within the same orchestra. The diversity of double bass tunings has been much discussed in existing literature on the instrument, and the historical performance movement has inspired modern double bassists to revive some historical tunings. Studies have so far focused mainly on cataloging historical tunings documented in primary sources. Explanations of why German tuning became the standard as others fell out of use are brief and tend to hinge on the presumption of a progress narrative that establishes German tuning as superior to historical alternatives, a view which is inevitably reinforced by a retrospective bias that stems from the tuning's current predominance. Authors tend to attribute the decline of historical tunings to a few basic shortcomings. For example, the French tuning was too difficult for the left hand, the Italian tuning too limited in its lower compass, and the Viennese tuning too irregular. While these criticisms are not unfounded, explanations remain underdeveloped and fail to provide a satisfactory account of the decades-long process of international standardization that involved not only luthiers, string makers, and musicians, but also the musical institutions that trained and employed double bassists throughout Europe and the Western world. Okay. In this paper, I explore tuning as a defining feature of the 18th and 19th century double bass and its distinctive regional variants. I first introduce concepts from the field of behavioral archaeology to investigate the choices and compromises involved in standardizing double bass tuning over the course of the 19th century. Next, I examine how tuning affects the instrument's sound by comparing bridge admittance measurements of 4 historical tunings on one instrument. I propose that approaches from behavioral archaeology can help expand on existing discussions of historical double bass tunings, and can also be applied to the study of musical instruments more widely. Behavioral archaeology focuses on the relationships between human behavior and material objects. The approach has been used to study technologies ranging from prehistoric pottery to the early electric car, exploring how they perform in different use contexts, and how their performance characteristics influence human behavior over the course of a technology's production, use, and disposal. According to the behavioral perspective, a performance is defined relationally as the engagement of one interactor with another. These interactors can be human, artifact, or extern, and externs are elements of the natural world. A performance characteristic is a capability, competence, or skill that could be exercised in a given interaction. Performance characteristics may be utilitarian, social, or symbolic, but they must be behaviorally relevant, which means they should be recognizable to the people who interact with the technology and have the potential to influence their behavior. Michael Schiffer and James Skibbo developed the performance matrix as a heuristic tool for comparing competing technologies or variants of a technology. They emphasized looking for patterns of compromise based on the premise that an artifact's performance characteristics cannot all achieve high values in every use activity. The performance matrix allows one to visualize patterns in these compromises to see which activities were favored and which were disadvantaged. As Schiffer and Skibbo contend, it clarifies which performance characteristics seem to have influenced acquisition decisions and also illuminates the resultant compromises in use. Rather than adhering to progress narratives that attribute the demise of one technology to the inevitable triumph of a superior technology, an analysis based in the performance matrix explores the complexity of choices and compromises surrounding the adoption of one technology over one or more alternatives. This performance matrix compares the 4 regional double bass tunings, ranking their relative values for various performance characteristics in a number of performance contexts. This matrix is not exhaustive, but includes the contexts and characteristics that are most behaviorally relevant. Orchestral playing as part of a bass group, including at a minimum cello and double bass, but also encompassing basso continuo configurations with keyboard and other bass instruments, is considered separately from orchestral playing in a double bass section, which is double basses grouped together and separate from the cello section, like we see in a modern orchestra. The bass group function was the convention in the 18th and early 19th centuries, and the separation of the double bass section became increasingly common throughout the 19th century, alongside the growth of the orchestra. The distinction is relevant since the sectioning off of the double basses in the orchestra coincided with a reduced tolerance for performance practices such as octave transposition and simplification, which had been a matter of course in the 18th century bass group. The lower compass of each tuning is related to the ability to play bass lines fully in the 16-foot octave, avoiding the practice of transposing notes or entire passages an octave higher to sound in unison with the cello. Likewise, the intervals between open strings affect the ability to perform fast passages as written and avoid the practice of simplifying bass parts. A smaller interval between open strings increases left-hand facility by reducing the need for shifting. The utility of Viennese tuning in D major and closely related keys has led to the common belief that its decline was brought on by the increased complexity of romantic harmony. Paul Brun offers the grossly exaggerated explanation that Viennese tuning, quote, rendered modulations in the course of a piece virtually impossible. Neither primary source evidence nor the experience of modern performers who play in the tuning provide support for these claims. As an alternative theory, I propose that there may be a connection between the non-uniform fingering patterns that Viennese tuning requires, its lack of method books or other signs of institutionalized training, and its decline coinciding with the rise of the modern European conservatory system. As the training of professional musicians transitioned to the conservatory system, the amenability of attuning to systematic fingering patterns would give it an advantage. Several early double bass methods were written by conservatory directors or others who did not actually play the instrument in any professional capacity. Even when the authors were double bassists, they often followed the example of method books for other stringed instruments. It was simpler to codify fingering patterns for uniform tuning with the same interval between all open strings, especially for those authors with little to no experience playing the instrument. Several primary sources also criticize the sound of the Viennese bass, noting both its tone quality and a tendency for the strings to buzz against each other or the fingerboard when bowed too vigorously. More general remarks on the effect that adding or removing strings has on an instrument's tone are also widespread. 18th and 19th century sources describe double basses with fewer strings as having a better tone and sounding stronger, clearer, and more distinct, and those with more strings as having a weaker and thinner sound. Although many preferred the sound of the three-string double bass, there came a point when the extension of the lower compass was thought to be worth a sacrifice in sound. This debate was central to a musical congress on orchestral practices held in Milan in June 1881, which led to the adoption of the four-string instrument by the entire bass section at La Scala in January 1882, despite objections from principal double bassist Luigi Negri. Published proceedings reported that although many agreed that the three-string double bass sounded better, the extended lower compass of the four-string double bass in German tuning was determined to be a greater priority. Sources also consistently describe an inverse correlation between the number of strings on an instrument and their diameters. Five-string double basses had thinner strings than four-string basses, which had thinner strings than three-string basses. Assuming the strings are made of the same material, in this case gut, thicker strings will have a higher tension than thinner strings tuned to the same pitch. Higher mass, higher tension strings produce more energy, which translates to a more powerful sound. But an instrument can only handle so much tension on the top plate. When the optimal total tension on the instrument is divided across more strings, the individual tensions, and thus the diameters of each string, must be decreased to avoid impeding the instrument's resonance or even causing damage. The differences in sound that resulted from these stringing tendencies influenced authors' preferences for one tuning over others. Different performance contexts would, of course, affect which sound qualities were valued most. For 18th and early 19th century orchestral playing, when the double bass was used almost exclusively to double the 8-foot bass line, a sound that blended with the cello and added depth to the bass line would have been acceptable, if not ideal. As the cello and double bass were increasingly given independent parts, an articulate and full low register that could stand on its own and support the whole orchestra would become more desirable. Taking the Viennese and Italian tunings as extremes, the five-string Viennese tuning produces the first set of qualities. In the low register, it blends with and adds depth to the 8-foot bass line, and in the higher registers, its relatively thin strings give it a characteristically resonant, if nasal, sound. The three-string Italian tuning, which is described in historical sources as rich, violent, robust, and round, gave it an edge fulfilling its role as the foundation of the growing 19th century orchestra. In order to investigate these differences further, I commissioned a new instrument that can be set up with 3, 4, or 5 strings. The instrument was built by Tom Wolfe in Virginia and has interchangeable necks, one for the 5-string Viennese tuning with frets, and another for 3- and 4-string tunings. Wolfe also made bridges in 3 different styles, a 4-string 18th century model with extra notches for 3-string setups, a 5-string Viennese bridge based on a surviving Stadelmann instrument belonging to the Esterhazy Private Foundation, and a 3-string bridge modeled after a double bass formerly owned by Domenico Dragonetti and housed since his death in 1846 at St. Mark's Basilica in Venice. Gut strings were custom made by Gamut Strings on consultation with Dan Larson. I calculated string diameters to produce a combined tension of 116 kilograms in equal tension sets for each setup. All strings were made in pure gut except the low E and F in German and Viennese tuning, which were made with a gut core wrapped in silver-plated copper wire. So the most common, or one of the most common measurements in the study of string instrument acoustics is bridge admittance, which measures an instrument's frequency response when energy is put into the bridge. With the assistance of Douglas Beaton, a PhD candidate in music technology at McGill, I took measurements of the new bass setup in its various tunings. The procedure involved exciting the bridge with an impact hammer that measures input force and recording the output response with a laser Doppler vibrometer, or LDV. So in the picture on your left, you can see the LDV with the laser hitting the treble side of the bridge, and on the right, you can see the hammer lined up to hit the bass side of the bridge. A frequency response function can then be plotted, which represents the relationship between the input and output data. This graph shows the frequency response of the four tunings. The close correspondence of the four curves up to around 600 hertz is not surprising for measurements of the same instrument, and inconsistencies in this range can be attributed to some of the practicalities of taking measurements on playable setups. Different bridges are needed to accommodate varying numbers of strings, and the Viennese setup involves an entirely different neck. A more significant divergence occurs around 850 hertz, so that is like the last quarter of the graph on the right there. And there we see that the Viennese tuning curve drops off, while the French and Italian curves show a much stronger response. The German curve lies between the Viennese and the French and Italian curves. Between 1300 and 1800 hertz, the difference between the 3-string tunings and the 5-string Viennese tuning hovers around 5 to 7 decibels. And just to give you a point of reference, 10 decibels is usually heard as twice as loud. And for another point of reference, this range that is where they diverge the most is about 4 octaves above the frequencies of the open strings. Okay. Although in practice, the setup for each tuning involves a specific bridge, we also took measurements of the different tunings on every bridge that could accommodate them. So you can put 3 strings on a 5-string bridge, but you can't put 5 strings on a 3-string bridge. The width of the bridge varies based on how many strings it is designed to accommodate, which, along with some other elements, affects its mass. The 3-string bridge weighs 103 grams, the 4-string bridge is 129, and the 5-string bridge weighs 124 grams. The 3-string bridge also has more arched legs compared to the square profile of the other 2, and lacks the widened feet that are standard on violin family instruments today. So this second graph shows the French, Italian, and German tunings, essentially tested on every bridge that I could put them on, and what we see is that between the different bridges, there's a strong correspondence. So all the tunings that could be put on the 3-string bridge, just French and Italian, those are those top 2 curves. Then we have the 4-string bridge set up with French, Italian, and German tuning in the middle, and then on the bottom, we have the 5-string bridge with also the 3 tunings. So just to make that easier to see, here we have the Italian tuning on 3 bridges, and we see very clearly the effect that the bridge versus what the tuning would do on its own has. The generally stronger response of the 3-string bridge is likely due in part to its lighter mass, but not everything can be attributed to mass. What we see is that the 5-string bridge has a generally weaker response, but it actually weighs a little bit more than the 4-string bridge. Did I say that backwards? The 5-string bridge, I think I said it wrong, but you can see the weights and you can see the graphs, so yes, that's why I put that on the slide. Okay, these measurements are a first step in exploring the relationship between historical tunings and double bass acoustics. Additional studies would be needed to determine which features of the bridge affect the response in various frequency ranges and to what extent. Furthermore, bridge admittance alone does not give a full picture of the instrument's tonal characteristics. These measurements do not account for how the string excites the bridge or how the bow interacts with the string. However, even without accounting for precisely how different setups affect the sound of an instrument, these results highlight the importance of exploring sound more thoroughly along with technical and musical characteristics when examining the standardization of double bass tuning that occurred over the course of the 19th century. Considering an instrument's sound as a performance characteristic can provide insight into the values and priorities held by the musical communities who use that instrument. More broadly, behavioral archaeology's emphasis on choices, compromises, and the contextualization of a technology's material features in action and in interactions offers a promising approach to expanding our understanding of how musical humans, be they performers, composers, luthiers, or others, interact with musical instruments. And so just before I take questions, I wanted to just emphasize how much collaboration was involved in this project. So I want to thank Tom Wolfe and Wolfe Instruments for making the bass, Dan Larson and Gamut Strings for making the strings, and Douglas Beaton for helping me take the measurements of the bass. And I also want to thank AMIS for the support provided by a small research grant for students and the Gribbon Travel Award. Thank you.
Thank you, Shanti. I'm gonna start us out with a question. And so from a maker's perspective, I would always think that the bridge is gonna have so much influence over that. And then seeing your last graph that you showed that the different tunings responded similarly based on the bridge type that they were on. Mm-hmm. So I wonder if you could just speak to that a little bit more. And I know you haven't done tests on that yet, but if you can theorize or extrapolate or give us your thoughts on the impact of bridge and bridge design, and as it would get later into the shape of the bridge, the shape of the heart, the shape of the kidneys, the way, the shoulder slope, all the different features of the bridge that I think would impact it quite heavily. So if you could just
I can
talk for that.
Theorize,
talk
maybe.
That. Yeah.
So obviously mass does something because, the more wood you have in between the string and the instrument, the less energy is going to go through. But it didn't totally correlate there because I don't have the graph up anymore. Anyway, so the lightest bridge wasn't necessarily the one, the heaviest bridge wasn't necessarily the one with the weakest response. So something like the arching of the three-string bridge, the Dragonetti bridge, is really unique, and that I think might even be more important than the mass. Also the width of I don't know all the right words, but like the waist. So if you have, since the bridge has to rotate around the sound post or whatever, like the width of that waist section is going to influence it. And whether you have the splayed feet or not, I think is going to influence it. Having like a square shape versus the arch. And I'm not so sure about the cutouts, but that might also.
I know myself and a lot of other violin makers would be interested in working with you on taking measurements with that. So we'll talk about that. But let's open it up. Oh, we've got one right there.
Thanks so much for your paper. I'm not sure if this is going to be redundant after your question, Matt, but I was curious about, in regards to the shape of the bridge, the asymmetrical curvature was quite curious. I was wondering if you could speak to that.
Yeah, that, has to do with playability. So it was pretty important to me that I didn't just get an instrument and test unplayable combinations of things. Like some of the second graph I showed, obviously I was testing, if you put 4 strings on a 5-string bridge, you have this really awkward gap in the middle and you can't play that. But I wanted to have playable setups because it doesn't really make sense to me to test something you can't use in real life. But yeah, so like the treble side is going to be lower usually than the bass side, and that's just because of clearance of the bow. So I don't know if that answers your question, but
I'm also not a string player, so.
okay, yeah, it has to do with making it playable. Mm-hmm.
All right, so I'm coming at this from hearsay because we actually spoke a little bit, but specifically about the Viennese tuning, because you were discussing the behavioral aspects of these different tunings. As I understand it, and I could be wrong, the Viennese tuning was mainly used as a tuning for soloists. Could part of the reason why that particular tuning kind of fell out of use be because bass string instrument solo playing fell out of usage, and therefore the tuning as well? Is that the main reason why it went away, or were there other reasons?
It wasn't actually mainly used for soloists, but the most famous players maybe were the soloists because they were soloists. So like Mozart symphonies, Haydn symphonies, those would have been played in the orchestra on Viennese bass, anything from that period. And I guess I could have gone back to one of my slides, but it is true that the Viennese bass has a lot of pluses in the solo side, whereas like the French tuning was all minuses there, because playing like a really high tension tuning in fifths where you're like moving around all the time isn't going to work very well for solo tuning. So that could be part of it. But I do think that this current narrative that we have where it's like, oh, well, it can't play in flats and you can't modulate is totally wrong, and we need to stop saying that. Yeah.
Stella?
To what you just finished saying, besides the data on the graphs and the technical pluses and minuses, did your hands and your ears find a favorite setup? Is there something that was different enough that it sounded most comfortable to you as a player?
So my background is, I started on German tuning, which is modern tuning, so obviously that's like the easiest for me. I've played quite a bit in Italian tuning, which is you just like take a string off, but you make them heavier. I really like that because it sounds really punchy. It's like really fun to play. I've done a bit in Viennese tuning, which it's like easy, but I don't have the most experience in that, but it definitely influences like how you approach the instrument and how you feel playing it. Like, oh, like really powerful, punchy, I'm gonna hold up the whole ensemble, or like I'm just gonna float on top of everything. I would say French tuning I haven't mastered yet, and I can't really speak to at this point.
We've just got a couple minutes. Monica?
Yeah, you're obviously using the same instrument for your measurements. But would an instrument that is designed for 5 strings or 3 strings or 4 be built differently and respond differently, therefore? And what's the importance of that?
That's a great question. I really like that question because actually most original Viennese instruments have been like retrofitted to be modern basses. And like a very good example of this is Dragonetti's instrument currently in Venice, which was built for 5 or 6 strings. By the time he got it, it had a 3-string neck on it. Sometime later in his career, he put a 4-string neck on it and tried that, decided he didn't like it, took a string off. So a lot of surviving instruments that we have these traces of changing the necks. Obviously, they're built differently, so like the sound holes will be further apart if it was built for 6 strings. But I think the fact that that's so fluid actually makes it make more sense to test the same instrument just to see like what people were experimenting with back then too.
Thank you.
This will be the last question.
Thank you. Great presentation. I was wondering about the solo repertoire, if with all these different tunings there are clear trends of preferences of different keys. So, for example, I would suppose that the Viennese tuning is not ideal for a G minor piece, or so if there are a G major piece, or if they are like clear trends of typical, as with the guitar repertoire, like preferred keys? Is it similar with these tunings?
Definitely, yeah. So for Viennese tuning, D major, or if you want to play an E flat major, you tune up everything a half step, so a scordatura, which I left out intentionally from this. I think it's too complicated. And then if you're tuning in fourths, like G major is really common. A minor, for some reason, works really well in fourths tuning. I can't really say about fifths tuning because it doesn't really, there's no solo music written for it, so I wouldn't know what keys. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, Shanti.
Thank you.
I'm gonna sneak in.